Hi, Omar. Thank you so much for joining us today. Before we begin, if you want to give us a brief introduction and tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Sure. Thank you for having me, Alicia. My name is Omar Ha-Redeye. I'm a lawyer primarily situated in the GTA, the Greater Toronto Area. And a lot of my work, I would say the majority of my career, has very much been focused on access to justice. So I'm very much looking forward to having this conversation with the two of you.
Great, thanks so much. So I'll start with our first question. It's, what does access to justice mean to you and in the work that you do?
So access to justice for me really means problem solving to find creative solutions to the situations or challenges that people are facing in society. I think it probably warrants some explanation as to what that means. And so what I'll say is that this may or may not include remedies that are found within the legal system, because it may seem paradoxical, but our legal system is not necessarily always synonymous with justice. It's not that we're trying to frustrate justice, it's just that there are many inherent limitations to the legal system that often don't provide the best option, the best remedy, the best solution, if you will, for many people who are facing a legal problem. And so what I like to really emphasize for people who I have access to justice conversations with is that most justice or most notions of justice are usually or often found outside of the courts. That's actually where most legal problems are solved in our societies.
I'm just curious, could you talk a little bit more about access to justice being found outside of the courts, maybe an example or two?
Certainly, yeah. I mean, I think the easiest example is just to point to civil litigation. So the delays in our court system simply because of how much volume the courts are facing means that it quite often will take 6, 7 years or more for a matter to get to trial. And so the reality is that in civil litigation, there's very little that actually goes to trial. The vast majority of civil disputes are ultimately resolved through alternative dispute resolution. Now, that may be happening in parallel with civil litigation, but the actual solution, the actual justice, if you will, the actual conclusion to this legal dispute is not coming necessarily by way of judicial intervention, but it's coming by way of lawyers who are open-minded, willing to communicate, maintain the appropriate level of decorum and civility with each other, and to find ways to have both parties come out with a win-win solution. And that is a very different conception of justice, I think, than most members of the public conceive of the legal system. And I think a lot of that is just because of portrayals in the media and the assumptions that you're going to have a judge that comes as a neutral arbiter and gives the solution, if you will, that is going to resolve the problem. And in reality, that's not actually what happens in most cases.
That's a very interesting perspective. Thank you so much. Our next question for you is how you would advise aspiring legal advocates to begin their journey in making contributions to invoke access to justice.
It's a good question because I think it's tied to another broader problem that we're seeing, which is rising tuition, especially for law students. I think Ontario is the only jurisdiction in Canada to date that has a paralegal, licensed paralegals. And so that has been a critical, in my opinion, pathway to providing or creating legal representation within our legal system, trained legal representation. And the tuition burden comparative to law school is significantly different. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind, is that it's very difficult to say, I am going to contribute towards access to justice. I am going to keep my fees low. I'm going to make a difference in how I practice law when you're dealing with a massive tuition burden and debt that you have to pay down. I think that's probably the biggest challenge that I think most early career professionals in the legal industry are facing. And so I think that's something that I would highlight, is that we all, many of us enter into the legal system with many aspirational goals and ideals. The practical realities of the law make that much more challenging to execute. And so, a little bit of pragmatism, a little bit of caution in terms of being realistic about what can and cannot be done, and also a recognition that the legal industry is inherently conservative. And I don't mean that politically, I mean conservative in the sense that It is resistance to change. It is very much in promoting the status quo, and not necessarily for negative reasons. It does that because it's trying to promote stability. Stability is typically a good thing in society. We want to have stability, and many of us are not feeling that stability right now with the pandemic, when many of our plans have gone out the windows and we're dealing with a very different type of situation. But because the legal system moves in that way or changes very incrementally, it can be very difficult or challenging to actually see significant modifications or improvements in our legal system within a short period of time. So that's something that I would say as well, in terms of people entering the profession, to be careful about what their expectations might be about what can be achieved.
Our next question is, when did you become passionate about access to justice? Was there a moment, a story, or a realization? Please share your experience.
It's a tough question. It's not that I don't mind answering it. It's just, I think every single one of us have some inherent notion of justice within us. We usually develop it in our childhood. It might be with a sibling, and you know, they're not sharing a toy that should be shared, or you think that it's your turn to play on the playground and they're not letting you do it. But it can come up in other contexts as well. And so I think we all have this notion that we should be treated fairly. And so for myself, I think probably at a very young age, I wouldn't be able to pinpoint exactly when that would be, but you know, Toronto, and quite frankly, even Canada, was a very, very different country over 40 years ago. So when that's my childhood, and it didn't have the diversity that it has today. It didn't have these concepts of inclusion. It didn't have a charter of rights and freedoms. And so, you know, these legal ideas that we have today that imbue our society, in my opinion, in very good ways, just weren't there. It wasn't part of the social fabric. And so certainly, I mean, I think, you know, we all experience challenges and difficulties, all of which inform and give rise to a notion that there perhaps is some inequalities or some need for greater justice in society. And so I think, like most kids, I don't want to make myself feel special or unique in that way, but you know, we all experience bullying in some way. And so I think in my mind, I really, really, really don't like bullies. I think that's sort of when people ask me about my passion in this area, that is where it stems from. And I think that it crystallizes in my mind most clearly about how much I dislike bullies, because I wasn't bullied throughout my childhood. By the time I became a teenager, you know, I grew taller, I grew some muscles, and I hung out with a tougher crowd, tougher than me, that's for sure. And so people didn't really mess with me too much once I was a teenager. And I remember very clearly, though, in high school, walking through the hallway and seeing a kid who was being held up on the locker, so being held up by a bully up against the locker, sort of, you know, as bullies do, slamming them into the locker. And this kid was, like, you know, bigger than me, you know, more muscular and tougher, or whatever you want to call it. But I guess because of my social crowd or my social environment, people didn't really mess with me too much in high school. So I remember very clearly going up to this bully who was actively bullying another kid and grabbing him and throwing him into the locker. And just, like, he didn't push back, he just didn't want to mess with me. And I turned to this kid and I said, look, if he ever messes with you again, let me know, and I'll take care of it. Okay. Again, not that I personally would be able to beat the person up, but it was just, there was something that really, really bothered me, seeing that happening before my eyes, that I had to sort of intervene. I think obviously invoking those memories that I had in my own mind about being bullied, in particular by older kids when I was a younger child, that really, from my mind today, when I look back, crystallizes an early experience about when you see an imbalance of power, or people who are using their strength or their power in ways that they shouldn't, that really does stir up in my mind a need to step forward and to step up and to put an end to that type of abuse of power.
Wow, that was very insightful, and it really makes you think about how law has such an impact on your life from birth all the way till death. You know, like, it's just, it always plays a role. And even the social notions of it, like, there's so many situations that kind of mirror what the law looks like. And then now you being able to step in and sort of resolve a dispute. Like that's kind of like what you do now. It's you obviously don't do it in a way where you maybe intimidate another person that way, but yeah, that was a really cool story, and thank you so much for sharing that with us.
My pleasure. Yeah, it's certainly we find more adult ways to deal with our conflicts and our fights as adults, I hope. But yes, I think that's very much where I think I've thought back about an early memory, and I think that's sort of where I can pinpoint that sense of injustice and the feeling that you need to actually get involved. And hopefully for many of you who are watching this video or involved in the Canadian Law Review, that you can also relate to that, you know, we all at some level don't like to see people being picked on. Like there's just something wrong with that inherently. And whether it's an employer who's doing that with an employee, whether it's the government, quite frankly, doing it with social groups that aren't as empowered, who don't have access to government in the same ways, or in other contexts. There's so many different ways in our society where there are imbalances in power, and people exploit those imbalances that cry out, if you will, for some intervention. And I think for those of us that hear that calling to enter the legal profession for those reasons, we are hopefully making society a better place.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Omar, and contributing towards the conversation around access to justice, as is one of CLR's founding pillars.
Yes, thank you so much. I'd like to echo Laisha's statements, and also we hope that the insight that you've shared today will inspire students in their legal journey and contributing to access to justice. Thanks so much, Omar.